je voudrais dire que je suis très honorée d'annoncer la 4e session de notre projet universitaire anti-guerre, une conférence pour la victoire, les orateurs du monde entier qui soutient l'Université nationale Vassil Karazin de Kharkiv, Ukraine. Après avoir modéré 13 de sections de ce projet, je dois dire que celle-ci revêt une importance particulière. Aujourd'hui, lors de cette table ronde commémorant les dates symboliques de l'histoire de l'Ukraine, nous abordons plusieurs questions de la plus haute importance pour l'Ukraine et pour le monde. La coopération scientifique et internationale, le génocide des Tatars de Crimée, l'histoire des génocides dans le monde et l'Holocauste et ses victimes, les études ukrainiennes dans le monde entier. À l'occasion de ces dates mémorables pour notre université et pour l'Ukraine entier, nous avons invité des universités, des leaders mondiaux à participer à un débat puissant que nous attendons avec une grande importance. Et nous sommes honorés, très honorés aujourd'hui de les présenter. But first, I would like to say, dear friends, that we are very, very happy to see every member of our Vassil Karazin Kharkiv National University community today, despite everything, the atrocities, unimaginable brutality, missile drone attacks that we experience each day. Thank you very much, dear heroes, for your stoicism, for your continuing work. Dear rectorate, dear deans, dear professors, dear faculty, thank you for being with us despite hardship and trauma. Merci à vous, grand merci à vous, chers amis de Karazin, d'être aujourd'hui malgré tout avec nous, malgré les atrocités, malgré les brutalités imaginables et les attaques des missiles et des drones chaque jour, quotidien. Merci pour votre stoïcisme et de votre travail continu, malgré toutes les difficultés et les traumatismes. With your kind permission, I have a great honor to introduce the speakers that have kindly agreed to be present at our event. Professor Karel Berkhof, a Dutch historian, professor at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, and a leading researcher at the Netherlands Institute for Research on the History of War, Holocaust, and Genocide. Professor Berkhof was unable to attend personally today, but he kindly recorded a video Zoom message for us with me, and we will demonstrate this video to you today. I am very proud to say that Professor Karel Berkhof recorded his message in Ukrainian, and he provided us with English language slides. Our next speaker today is Professor Matthew Pauly, dear friend of Ukraine and our university, a leading historian, a researcher for the history of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, professor at Michigan State University. Professor Matthew Pauly holds interests in the histories of nationalism and national identity, childhood and youth, education and philanthropy. Professor Pauly was our dear guest this spring and gave our project his full support. Professor Keith Gisson, a novelist, a journalist, literary translator, co-founder and co-editor of American Literary Magazine, #+1.
I have a Zoom.
Professor of Journalism at Columbia University, Graduate School of Journalism. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Professor Gisson, for being with us today. And our great friend, our fantastic friend of our university, a French actor and writer, a person of great heart and great courage, a person who, upon the first meeting with Karazinites, became a moral camerton to all of us. Notre ami, la personne que nous admirons, l'acteur français, l'écrivain français, la personne dont le courage et le grand cœur nous admirons chaque jour, la personne qui nous donne le soutien quotidien, qui est le commerton de notre morale. Cher Philippe Torreton, grand merci pour être avec nous aujourd'hui. Merci, grand ami de notre université. I would like to have the pleasure to introduce the person who is with us for the first time today. And this is Professor Robert Foley, our dear guest from the University of Kentucky, a leading specialist, a professor teaching security and diplomacy courses at Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. Dear Professor Polly, I'm so happy to see you today. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for waiting so much, and thank you for giving us your full support. We are very happy to introduce Professor Nicoleta Simpos from Worcester University, a professor of Shakespeare Studies, a director of research group at Worcester University. Dear Professor Nicoleta, thank you so much for being with us today. Soyez le bienvenu. We are so happy to see all of you. And now, with your kind permission, I would like to step down in favor of people who let Kharkiv University survive, thanks to whom Kharkiv University goes on and fights its way towards freedom. I would like to introduce and to step down with great honor and great gratitude to our Vice Rector, Professor Boris Vadimovich Samorodov, who has been with us since the first day the project was launched, a person of great heart, great mind and support. Boris Vadimovich, thank you so much for everything you have done for us. A doctor of economics, a professor of economics, an academician of the Academy of Economic Sciences of Ukraine. Dear Boris Vadimovich, would you please say the words of greeting on behalf of Vasil Karazin, Kharkiv National University? And you cannot imagine how grateful we are to you every day that you are with us. Шановний Борисе Вадимовичу, дозвольте мені від усієї нашої команди низький уклін вам за все, що ви робите для нас і за те, що ви з нами. Будь ласка, я з великою честю хочу надати вам слово і прошу вас привітати наших шановних гостей.
Дякую.
Дуже
Good
дякую.
afternoon. On behalf of Karazin community, I am honored to welcome today our distinguished guests, our colleagues and students, and open the 14th session of the project One Lecture Before the Victory. I would like to say thank you for all of the time and dedication you spent to support this initiative and share your knowledge and expertise with us. We are grateful to you for being on the same side with us on the importance of supporting inspiration and motivation of Ukrainian students and at such difficult times. This is when it is essential to raise such relevant issues and the genocide of the Crimean Tatar people, and to never let history repeat itself. We should engage young generation in active discussions and promote Ukrainian culture and science abroad. I truly hope that this project will establish the beginning of a fruitful collaboration between Karazin University and our honorable guests. Thank you.
Dear Boris Vadimovich, thank you so much. With your kind permission, I would like to say that the initiative for today's meeting was launched by our dear Dean, the Dean of the Department of Foreign Languages, Professor Virochenko Svetlana Andreevna. She was the one who inspired me to begin preparation for this particular memorable event. And I would like to express great gratitude and full admiration towards her initiatives. I tried to do my best. And Svetlana Andreevna, are you with us today? Our dean will join soon. Наш декан доєднається до нас, and we are moving on. And I would like to represent, with your kind permission, for the greeting words from our university, dear Professor Olga Igorevna Vovk, PhD in history, a deputy director of the Troyenko Center for Ukrainian Studies and Area Studies at Vasil Karazin, Kharkiv National University. Dear Professor Vovk, the floor is yours, and I am very happy to step down in your favor.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I would like to greet all participants of the present significant event. These days we commemorate the victims of the genocide of the Crimean Tatar people. This is one, but unfortunately not the only tragic page in the centuries-old history of Ukraine. Turning to the traumatic experience of the past is always difficult but necessary. And it's especially actual now when Ukraine fights for its survival. And already now we have to reflect how we will live after the Russian-Ukrainian war and how we will commemorate it. So I believe that the present discussion will not only touch on our past, but also will allow us about our future. I wish that the present discussion will be interesting and fruitful, and in our scientific relations with our guests, with our colleagues, will be continued later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Olga Igorevna. Thank you for being with us today. It is an honor. Dear guests, I would like to move on, but I would like to ask you to greet our dear audience today. We have remarkable presence among our dear audience today. And with your kind permission, I would like to say that since the recent, in terms of our discussion today, I would wish to say that since the recent movie adaptation of the novel Ender's Game, along with the continued strife in Syria, remind us that reality or fantasy, genocide is a topic we are unable to avoid, whether in the dark jungles of Congo, the sun-baked plazas of Turkey, or the snowy wastes of Auschwitz. Genocide has left scars the world over. And today we address this topic with regard to the Crimean Tatars in order to explore the human capacity for darkness and the human capacity for healing. At this point, I would like to say, and I'm very deeply privileged to say, that we are joined by Professor Thomas Leach as our audience member today from the University of Delaware, a leading expert on adaptation studies. Our dear guest, our dear speaker this spring, our dear friend, Professor Nina Berman from Columbia School of Journalism. Our speaker to be, our fantastic friend, Professor Mary Jo Salter. Thank you so much, dear friends, for being with us today, and thank you for supporting us. Thank you so much for that. À ce stade, je tiens à dire que nous sommes profondément privilégiés. Nous sommes profondément privilégiés d'être rejoints aujourd'hui par nos chers amis. Grand merci à vous. Grand merci à vous. Et aujourd'hui, nous allons examiner le sujet de génocide et les autres afin d'explorer la capacité humaine à l'obscurité. Et aussi, peut-être qu'il y a plus important encore, à la guérison. With your kind permission, dear friends, we would like to suggest a 15-minute format for the talk with the subsequent discussion for each of the speakers with your kind permission. And please, our great honor today is to start by demonstrating the video that Professor Karel Berkhof has kindly recorded for us. He's going to talk about European research Holocaust infrastructure and the way it functions. Dear Pani Victoria, would you please start the video? Шановна пані Вікторія, чи могли б, будь ласка, запустити відео, яке нам раду надав професор Карел Беркhof? Дуже дякую вам.
Я Karel Berkhof, історик України, Східної Європи та Голокосту. І я опублікував книгу про нацистську окупацію України, так званий Рейхскомісаріат України. Англійською мовою Harvest of Despair. Вона опублікована в українському перекладі Женева розпачу у 2011 році. І я є співдиректором ЕРІ. Що це таке? Європейська інфраструктура дослідження Голокосту. Це має місія. Місія є подолання фрагментації ресурсів про Голокост та прискорення цифрової трансформації досліджень Голокосту. З метою впроваджувати інновації у транснаціональні та міждисциплінарні дослідження і посилити соціальну актуальність теми Голокосту. Як Ері працює над виконанням своєї місії, вона дає забезпечення віртуального та фізичного доступу до ресурсів. Вона створює нові експертні спільноти. У нас є підготовка наступного покоління фахівців, практиків, і ми поширюємо результатів досліджень Голокосту. Ми маємо деякі основні принципи, як тут видно, англійською. По-перше, для істориків архіви є основною дослідницькою інфраструктурою. Архіви. По-друге, в історичних дослідженнях цифрова інтеграція повинна йти пліч-о-пліч з особистою взаємодією, зустрічами між науковцями, стипендії, семінарі тощо. По-третє, необхідна є міждисциплінарна співпраця між архівістами, істориками та цифровими гуманітаріями. І для того, щоб дослідження були інноваційними і щоб забезпечити пам'ять про Голокост, як формуючи європейський досвід, необхідна є транснаціональна інтеграція. Тобто це наші принципи. Цей проєкт існує в рамках програми Європейського Союзу «Горизонт», і ми маємо понад 6 мільйонів євро. І ми маємо різні партнери з різних країн, як ви бачите. Тут також є мапа, де видно навіть Львів, бо ми маємо український партнер, Центр міської історії. Тобто, ми вже ідентифікували 2229 архівних установ, що зберігають відповідні архівні джерела, розташованих у багатьох країнах, і ми інтегрували інформацію про майже 400 більше архівних одиниць. Ми маємо різні рівня інтеграції. Головне тут є, що кількість користувачів нашого порталу продовжує зростати. І так виглядає, наприклад, наш портал. Тут ми бачимо один фонд з Києва, і тут є опис колекції, тобто не самі джерела, а це описи колекції. Що там є і які показчики маємо або ні. Тобто тут є візуальна репрезентація, що ми робимо ще раз. Тобто, по-перше, у нас є цифрова інфраструктура, тобто це онлайн-портал, онлайн-навчання, блог про документи, цифрові видання джерел, та ми створюємо також цифрові методи. І по-друге, у нас є транснаціональна спільнота, ми маємо стипендіальну програму імені Коні Кристал, ми маємо навчальні семінари, методологічні семінари та конференції. Зараз іде також інший процес перетворення на консорціум. Тобто це так званий ЕРИК, це окрему юридичну особу. Бо тепер ми є тільки проєкт, так? Такі проєкти мають, програми мають кінець, але ми хочемо бути не навічно, але на довгий період. Тобто це особиста окрему юридичну особу. І цей Ерік почне повноцінну роботу у січні 2025 року. І так виглядатиме наша структура. Головне є, що ми маємо вже різні країни, які підтримують цей новий підхід, наприклад, Австрія, Німеччина, Ізраїль і так далі. Тобто вони будуть платити за цей Ерік. Ну, тут також важливо, що сказати про наші стосунки з Україною. Ми маємо і вже мали довгий час спеціальний розділ в нашому онлайн-курсі про Україну. Ви можете там читати і щось дізнати про Голокост в Україні, читати самі джерела, інколи навіть переклади. Як я вже сказав, ми маємо український партнер, Центр міської історії у Львові, є членом консорціуму. І по-третє, наш портал додає детальну інформацію про регіональні архіви СБУ. Це цікава річ, що ці архіви маловідомі, але там величезна кількість даних про так званих колаборантів, жертв і так далі. Але де можна знаходити ці дані, це дуже важко. Тому ми починали це робити. І я думаю, що ніде інше можна знаходити такі інформації. Ну, звичайно, ми також засудили вторгнення, повноцінне вторгнення Росії. Це так званий стейтмент. І ми підтримуємо контакт з усіма відомими дослідниками Голокосту в Україні та за її межами. І ми маємо базу даних про можливості допомоги. Також у нас є такий документ-блог, блог документів, і він крив спеціальний трек «Холокост в Україні», що включає автобіографію, наприклад, як перше число, так сказати. Там є автобіографічний нарис Олександра Круглова, який народився у Харкові і є визнаним засновником досліджень Голокосту в Україні. І це його перший автобіографічний текст. My experience of studying the Holocaust. Там він описує, як важко було в минулому і яке становище тепер. Також ми маємо подкаст, і цей подкаст фокусується на об'єктах. І перший епізод, там ми співпрацювали з Національним музеєм історії України у Другій світовій війні, бо там знаходиться цікава річ, друкарська машина, якою користувався Анатолій Кузнецов, київський автор відомої книги Бабій Яр російською мовою. І я там трохи розповідаю про цю цікаву людину Анатолій Кузнецов. Тобто ми щось робимо щодо України, і я хочу сказати у самому кінці, що від імені Ері та від себе я особисто дякую за вашу увагу, і, звичайно, ми бажаємо вам безпеки з психічного та фізичного здоров'я. Я особисто побоюся, що вам доведеться жити з наслідками нинішньої антиукраїнської агресивної війни протягом дуже довгого часу, але повірте, поруч з вами будуть інші європейці, які будуть готові підтримати вас і працювати разом з вами. Дякую і будь здоров.
Шановний професор Беркхоф, якщо ви дозволите українською мовою від щирого серця подякувати вам за все, що ви з такою великою душею робите для України, для Харківського національного університету, для вшанування пам'яті і для запобігання нових подібного роду ситуацій в майбутньому. With my full heart, on behalf of Kharkiv National University, on behalf of my country, my city of Kharkiv, Ukraine, I would like to thank you so much for everything you have done, you are doing, and you will do to prevent such situations from happening and to preserve the cultural memory, which is of tremendous importance. And I was deeply honored to meet you in person today. Це велика честь для мене.
Дякую вам. Я вважаю, що ви українські, ви герої теперішнього часу. Ми просто сидимо у Заході і читаємо про ваші жахливі події. Але дякую за ваші слова, надзвичайно. Дякую вам.
Дякую вам. Thank you so much. The memory of Holocaust is fully preserved in Ukraine. I grew up watching films, documentaries, having family stories, reading books. And I think this also very much contributes to formation of humane attitude to the world in Ukrainian citizens. So I think the awareness of this should be raised, and I would really do my best to advocate more profound Holocaust studies in our university. We would be deeply honored. Thank you so much for everything you have done for us today.
Thank you too.
For your time.
Okay. Best
I will
wishes.
send you the link to all our future events.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Дуже вдячна вам, пані Вікторія. Thank you so much. Our dear guest gave a talk in Ukrainian. I would like to briefly summarize the main mission of the organization he represented. Thank you very much, Professor Berkhof, a leading expert on studies of genocide. Transnational Holocaust research commemorates and educates. This is the mission of European Holocaust research infrastructure, and its main challenge is the wide dispersal of sources and expertise across many institutions. Dear friends, I would like to move on with our agenda, with your kind permission. Our next speaker, Professor Matthew Pauly, will be with us shortly. He's a little bit beyond time, but he will be joining us in a couple of minutes. So I would like to, with your kind permission, give the floor to our dear speaker, dear Professor Gessen, dear Keith. We would like to welcome you on behalf of our university today. And would you please kindly take the floor? We are very happy to have you. And the floor is all yours. Thank you very much. Would you please join in? And after that, we will have a little discussion of the first two talks.
Great.
Thank
hi,
you
everybody.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Legata, for inviting me. I've only been to Kharkiv one time in 2014. I was coming back from a reporting trip to Donetsk, actually. And I spent 2 days in Kharkiv. It was a beautiful city, and I very much hope to return there soon. And I've been really horrified by what the Russian army has been doing to Kharkiv. The last time I was in Ukraine was in March of last year, and I only made it to Lviv. And I mostly wrote about people fleeing from Eastern Ukraine from the fighting. And I met a lot of people from Kharkiv in Lviv, and I was struck both by their attachment to Kharkiv, to their city, to their homes. The vast majority of them did not want to leave, had stayed there really much past the time when I think most people would have left, and only finally left, when they really the situation became impossible. And I think most of them were looking forward to returning home. So I'm also looking forward to returning to Kharkiv as soon as I can. So I'm not going to use my full 15 minutes, but I just want to talk a little bit about what journalism has been doing, mostly American journalism, and just what I've been thinking about as it's been happening. One thing that has been sort of disturbing for a journalist about the current conflict is the form of anti-journalism being practiced by Russian journalists, pro-government Russian journalists. I'm sure some of you have watched sort of Russian reports from Donbass or Mariupol, where our journalists will come there. They'll have a camera crew. They will talk to people, and they will say things that are the exact opposite of the truth. For a journalist, this is extremely disturbing. The idea, our practice, our belief is that if you go somewhere and you talk to people, you will thereby arrive at something like the truth. It turns out that you can go somewhere and talk to people, and it will look like journalism. It will have all the kind of trappings and appearances of journalism, but in fact, it will be anti-journalism, and you will arrive at the opposite of the truth. So I think that has certainly given a lot of us kind of pause and room to kind of think about our profession and think more deeply about what exactly we are doing. The interest in Ukraine has been extremely high in the United States. The way in which Ukrainian people have resisted Russian aggression has been incredibly inspiring. That story has been a story that Americans have wanted to read continuously for over a year now, and that has been quite, more surprising to me, I have to admit. The American public is a fickle public. Their attention span is short, and their sort of interest in this story, their continuing interest in this story, has been, one of the kind of pleasant surprises, one of the few pleasant surprises of the last year and a half. I think there's a lot of there's a strong Ukrainian community in the U.S. and in Canada. There are also a lot of American Jews have personal connections to Ukraine. My own grandmother was born outside of Kiev in 1920, and a lot of American Jews share that kind of personal connection. One of the things that I've been thinking about, one of my colleagues at the New Yorker, Joshua Yaffa, wrote a report from Bucha not long after it was liberated by the Ukrainian army last spring. He described the horrors that had been endured by the people of Bucha, and he also made an interesting historical analogy, which I think is appropriate for today's conversation. He was talking about a man who whose mother was elderly and did not understand, and was going through the early stages of dementia, and did not understand exactly what was happening when the Russians came. And he said that he was trying to explain it in terms that she would understand. And what he said to her was, Mom, the Germans have come back. And and it was something from her childhood that he thought she would understand. And I thought that was a striking parallel and an appropriate parallel. The Russian army has behaved a lot like the German army when it came into Ukraine in 1941. what this has prompted a kind of thought that has prompted in me is also to kind of rethink what we know about actually the German experience of World War II. You know, there's been a long-standing argument in the West, which has not been resolved in a definitive way, about the kind of responsibility of the German people for World War II. And I think a lot of us are thinking right now about the responsibility of the Russian people for the current war. And I think it's a very complicated question. Something that I am working on right now, an article I'm working on right now, is actually talking to sociologists, people who do opinion polls about Russian support for the war. A figure that Russian propaganda has presented over and over again is something between 70 and 80% support for the war. In talking recently to sociologists who've been doing opinion polling in Russia, and encouraging, I think, finding that they have repeated to me over and over again is that actual support for the war, you know, enthusiastic support for the war is much, much lower, something more like 15%. Active opposition to the war is also quite low, about 10 to 15%. And then there is this kind of vast middle of people who will say, when you call them, you know, do you support the special military operation? And, you know, something like another 50% will say yes. But if you talk to them at greater length, it will turn out that their support is very thin. You know, what they actually want is for things to go back to what they were like before the war began. So I found that to be, I am finding that to be in certain ways an encouraging fact that you know, actual enthusiastic support for the war in Russia is quite low. In other ways, of course, it's discouraging that, you know, so many people who don't actually support the war nonetheless are not doing anything to oppose the war, and are giving their sort of passive support to the war. You know, and one of the things that that one of my sources said was, you know, repression works, propaganda works. These are things that we knew theoretically, but now we are seeing them working on an entire, you know, or most of an entire population. So that's something that I'm sort of thinking through and writing about right now. A few more words about what is happening with journalism in the U.S. The story in Ukraine has, as I've said, has generated a tremendous amount of interest. It is running into, at the moment, a crisis, a financial crisis in journalism. So, you know, America looks like the United States is headed for a recession. So right now, one of the main American radio broadcasters, National Public Radio, NPR, they had a terrific correspondent named Tim Mack, who was covering the war in Ukraine. A few months ago, they had a huge round of layoffs. And actually fired or laid off their Ukraine war correspondent. And kind of as a sort of, you know, and this is a story about, you know, the crisis in American media. It's also a story about sort of dedication of journalists to this story. Tim Mack, actually, he was in the US on a kind of return trip when he was laid off, and he went back to Ukraine, and he's still in Ukraine reporting about the war, and he's funding it himself. He's sort of crowdfunding it. So, but it is you know, and it does speak to a kind of greater story that's happening right now which is that the US is headed into sort of, I think, rough economic waters. And the other thing that it's headed into, and maybe some of the other panelists will talk about it, is a presidential election. And if there's one story that the American media finds very riveting, every 4 years, it is the presidential election. And this is a presidential election in which it is clear that the Republican Party, whether in the figure of Donald Trump or his current main opponent, Ron DeSantis, is going to be using Ukraine as a kind of, as a major subject in which to criticize the Biden administration. And they are going to be proposing a more isolationist approach, and they're going to be asking, why are we sending support to Ukraine? What are we doing in Ukraine? And that is going to create a challenging political environment for the Biden administration to continue its support for Ukraine. So what I'm seeing right now is kind of a lot of hope, I think, for the counteroffensive that's has perhaps already started or is going to be starting soon. A lot of hope, I think, in the presidential administration that is going to yield significant results, either to kind of support further, Western involvement and support for Ukraine, or even to put Ukraine in a position where it could negotiate with the Russians from a position of strength. But that's what I see right now in the media environment. And again, I'm really glad to have been given an opportunity to speak today. I look forward to hearing the other speakers, and I very much look forward to visiting Kharkiv as soon as possible.
Dear Professor Giesen, thank you very much. It's an honor. And we are eternally grateful to you and to dear Professor Berman, a great friend of ours, who kindly introduced us to each other and made this whole thing possible. Dear Nina, thank you so much for that. Dear audience, after listening to such a deep and such thought-provoking talk, maybe you would like to follow with some of the questions. Would you please? If you have the wish and desire to reserve your questions for a little bit later, we could move on with our next guest and we could have a discussion afterwards. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Professor Giesen. I guess the discussion will come a little bit later. People just need to just think a little bit for a while and to prepare for that. So I would love to introduce our dear next guest. Cher Philippe, c'est un grand honneur pour moi. Un grand honneur pour moi de vous donner la parole. Depuis que je vous ai rencontré, pour moi, la première fois, je voudrais dire que vous êtes un camerton de morale pour moi personnellement. Et votre nom, pour moi, associé avec la liberté intérieure, la noblesse, la générosité et la sagesse et aussi la fermeté des principes. Et nous sommes très reconnaissants que vous êtes avec nous aujourd'hui. Et je rêve toujours de vous donner la parole de nouveau et de nouveau. Grand merci à vous, s'il vous plaît. Our dear friend, French actor and writer, Philippe Tariton. Dear friends of our university, would you kindly take the floor? Cher Philippe, est-ce que vous êtes avec nous? Philippe? I think we had some technical internet trouble, so I think
Est-ce que vous m'entendez là?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Merci, grand merci. Cher Philippe, je suis très honoré de vous donner la parole. Merci, grand merci pour être avec nous. Je voudrais le faire de nouveau et de nouveau. Grand merci.
Merci à vous. Je suis très honoré d'être parmi vous et très intimidé aussi quand je vois la liste de tous ces professeurs émérites. Et, je ne suis qu'un modeste acteur français, mais comme vous disiez, avec une conscience individuelle, politique, et je ne peux pas séparer mon métier du monde. Mon métier d'acteur est un métier qui ouvre sur le monde. Je ne pense pas qu'on puisse être acteur sans regarder le monde, sans regarder les gens. Alors, plusieurs choses me viennent dans ce début de conférence, c'est que ce qui me fascine énormément, c'est notre volonté à nous d'êtres humains de se séparer du mal, à le reléguer très loin, à s'en faire une sorte à construire un mur entre le mal et soi-même. Or, j'estime que tout ce qui peut arriver de pire dans l'aventure humaine est toujours possible et est toujours en nous, en chaque individu. Et je pense que le théâtre, d'une certaine façon, l'art dramatique, est là pour nous le rappeler constamment. Le pire est en nous. Et évidemment, s'il y a le pire, le meilleur est en nous aussi. Mais il faut en avoir conscience à chaque instant de sa vie. Il ne faut jamais, à mon avis, se croire à l'abri du mal. Et j'en veux pour preuve, il y a quelques années, on m'avait demandé de faire la voix d'un documentaire qui se basait sur l'expérience d'un professeur américain, Milgram, qui essayait d'expliquer comment on peut amener toute une population à devenir complice d'un génocide. Et Milgram avait appliqué un principe assez simple qui est que une autorité vous demande de faire quelque chose et par obéissance, vous le faites. Et le documentaire dont on m'avait demandé de faire la voix avait remplacé l'autorité scientifique par une émission de télévision. Et dans cette émission de télévision, on demandait à des gens de faire des choses innommables à quelqu'un, c'est-à-dire, comme dans l'expérience de Milgram, de faire des chocs électriques à un cobaye et de plus en plus violents. Mais là, l'autorité supérieure n'était pas le monde scientifique, c'était juste les organisateurs d'une émission de télévision. Et ce qui était sidérant, c'est de voir que les résultats étaient exactement les mêmes. C'est-à-dire que l'obéissance à une autorité scientifique qui vous demande de faire quelque chose d'innommable pouvait exactement se calquer sur l'obéissance à une télévision, à une émission de télévision. Et là, je me suis dit en voyant ça que finalement, nous sommes toujours extrêmement fragiles dans notre entité humaine. Et je crois que le plus grand drame à l'heure actuelle, c'est de se considérer à l'abri. Et c'est en cela que je trouve que les réactions face à la guerre en Ukraine ne sont pas à la hauteur du drame qui est en train de se jouer. Je trouve que cette façon qu'ont les puissances occidentales de donner au compte-gouttes les armes, les munitions, ne sont pas à la hauteur du drame qui est en train de se jouer. Nous avons déjà, depuis trop longtemps, accepté trop de choses de la part de Poutine, que ce soit en Géorgie, la Crimée en 2014, et tous les signes étaient présents. Et je crois que si je lis ces deux éléments, c'est que nous sommes finalement, que d'une certaine façon, les pays occidentaux, c'est comme si on avait chassé le mal. On l'avait relégué aux frontières. Et nous ne voulons pas le voir. Nous ne voulons pas être en face de ce mal, puisque nous l'avons relégué trop loin. Et c'est ça qui m'interpelle en ce moment. Si nous avions plus conscience que le mal est en nous, possiblement en nous, comme le théâtre nous le rappelle, comme les auteurs dramatiques nous le rappellent, je pense que nous aurions tous des réactions plus vives et moins prudentes vis-à-vis du mal. J'espère que j'ai été clair, mais je suis à vous de me le dire.
Grand merci, cher Philippe. Si vous me permettez de dire une traduction
Oui.
en anglais, grand merci pour votre discours et pour le message de votre discours. Dear friends, our dear friend, Monsieur Philippe Tareton told about things that trouble him nowadays. And he was thinking about several most important issues as he sees them today, primarily about people's conscience. Secondly, about being constantly aware of the presence of evil around us and of the importance not to ignore this evil and never to think that this evil is not your business. So he was referring to the theater and major dramatic works of the world that can push us to the direct position of always trying not to be regarding the tragedy that is happening to somebody else, but trying to actively prevent it, trying to raise the awareness of the necessity to have a certain moral standard, to have a certain standard of conscience, a personal conscience that would not allow you to stay away from somebody else's trouble. The worst can happen to all of us. And as Philippe said, there is the worst in us and there is the best in us. So there is always a balance. But what we need to do is we need not to separate ourselves from the tragedy. And he was bringing several examples of people obeying blindly to the authority without thinking, without analyzing. He was quoting an experiment from a TV program that was dealing with that. And what Philip also mentioned, that we have been too compliant, we have been too permissive with the crimes that took place and were committed by Putin and the country he represents in Georgia, in Ukraine, 2014. We have been over permissive. So what we need to do right now is we need to connect the awareness raising necessity inside us and the necessity not to stay away from the tragedy. And if we had more awareness of the evil surrounding us, probably more awareness of the necessity not to ignore it, we would push our world to be a better place. Cher Philippe, grand merci pour avoir le message que vous l'avez donné aujourd'hui. Et I totally support you. Je soutiens chaque mot que vous avez dit. Grand merci. Grand merci. Dear guests, would you like to follow with the questions for now, or shall we move on? Maybe you've got some reflections, and I would like to read the message that was written in the chat. I'm grateful to you for such kind of meeting. This is hugely important, not to ignore the history and to raise awareness among as many people as possible. Cher Philippe, la communauté Karazin est d'accord avec vous et avec le message de votre discours, est très reconnaissant et tout à fait d'accord avec la nécessité de ne pas ignorer et obéir, oui, à l'autorité sans penser, sans réfléchir. Tout à fait d'accord avec vous, le message à l'heure du chat. Merci. Dear friends, dear Karazin academic community, dear guests, we are moving on with our program. And I would like to ask to give the floor to our dear guest today, Professor Robert Farley, representing the University of Kentucky Patterson School of Diplomacy and Security Issues. You're so welcome. International Relations. Dear Robert, we are so happy to have you today, and I'm so happy to meet you in person. Thank you so much. I'm very honored.
Well, Alya, thank you so much for having me. I want to express what an honor it is to be able to join everyone here at this institution, and how honored I am really to speak. To be asked to speak on the question of Ukraine and Ukraine's future. I cannot express in words my admiration for the Ukrainian people or for sort of what you all are pulling together right now. Alya asked me to speak a little bit about technology and the future of technology and Ukraine's technological future. This is a little bit awkward because I feel that everyone there knows more about this than I do, but I will do my best to spark some conversation about how we think about Ukraine's future as a technological leader and how that interacts with the war, but how essentially we can build a new technological future for Ukraine. There are a few parts of this. Really, there are three parts of this that I wanted to talk about. One of them is what I call a human capital part. Another one is a legal and regulatory part, which sounds boring, but it's one of the most important parts. And finally, there's the nature of the war itself and the impact of the war on Ukrainian society and Ukrainian economy. In terms of human capital, there is every reason to believe moving forward as this war ends, hopefully with victory, but as this war ends, that Ukraine is an extraordinarily fertile space for technological development in the future. It is a well-educated populace. It is a nationally committed population, a population that has displayed sort of degrees of unity which are almost unheard of in the West over the past 4 or 5 decades. So there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. The things that have to be done in order to maintain this optimism and in order to essentially fulfill this optimism, Ukraine's system of education from primary through secondary through the university system has to be maintained. It has to, when necessary, be reconstructed out of the damage that it has received. And it has to be drawn into broader networks with European, North American, East Asian university systems and educational systems, right? This is essentially the seed corn for the future of a technology economy in Ukraine. But there's every reason to believe that the foundation is strong, but the foundation has to be maintained and has to be reconstructed. Brain drain, as you know, is a significant issue, right? It's a significant issue that has been produced by the war itself, which has driven many people out of Ukraine. Those people have to be brought back, right? Those people have to be given good reasons to come back to Ukraine and to participate in a thriving, technologically advanced economy. That's absolutely critical to the future economic development, future technological development. International partnerships. This is something that my own university helps out with. It's something that the United States is actually pretty good at in terms of being supportive of sort of the future of technology economy in Ukraine. And it's really something that involves It involves a lot of individual relationship building. It involves a lot of work building structures that enable people in the United States, people in European universities, people in Asian universities to work directly with Ukrainians, whether over Zoom or through exchange programs, through a variety of other things that facilitate cooperation, that facilitate the transfer of knowledge. We are in a technological reality right now where those things are a lot easier than they were 40 or 50 years ago, but they still have to be done, right? And so the University of Kentucky itself, it needs to step up, and we need to come up with ways in which University of Kentucky and institutions like the University of Kentucky can be supportive of the development and the reconstruction of the Ukrainian education system. Ukraine already had a world-class university system. The war has disrupted that, but that's also a foundation that can be built on, right? And so all of the people who participated in the Ukrainian university system, the Ukrainian secondary education system before the war, those people can come back, right? They can be attracted back, and they can help build this sort of future of a very thriving technology economy. So that's the human capital part of it. You need people, right? You have people, but you need people to come back. When smart people are around, they're going to do really smart and really fun things together, and it's going to drive this economy. Second thing, and this one is a little bit more touchy, has to do with the legal systems which are going to guide Ukraine's economic and technological relationship with the West moving forward. Now, I think the United States has a little bit less of a role to play here than the European Union does. But the foundations have to be built for long-term regulatory cooperation between Ukraine and its neighbors to the West. Ukraine has to be drawn into the industrial and educational and technological systems that govern European technological development at this point. And this is already being done. And again, it's not really going to be shocking to anybody to hear this, but this has to continue, right? This is still something where work has to be done. The Europeans have to be convinced that this is a priority, and they have to continue pursuing this. Now, the role of the United States in this is twitchy, right? Because the United States, obviously is going to be a participant in some part, but the European role is much larger. The dangerous part of this is that after something like 20 or 30 years of sort of very open technological cooperation really all around the world, right? This is part of the system of globalization. We are really looking now at systems of technology and information cooperation, which are starting to become a lot more exclusionary. And this is in the United States primarily built around concern about competition with China, but also to some degree competition with Russia, but mostly about China. This is a dangerous situation because, essentially in the United States and in Europe, we are building information walls. We are building technological walls in order to keep the Chinese out, right? In order to keep the Chinese out and in order to keep the Chinese down. Ukraine can't stop those walls from being built, but we have to make sure that Ukraine is inside that wall rather than on the other side of that wall. And that's really, I think, absolutely critical to the way in which Ukraine is going to be, one of the pillars of the sort of broad transatlantic Western technology community, right? But that work has to be done, right? Ukraine has to be on this side of the wall rather than on the other side of the wall. And last, I want to talk just and again, I find it awkward to be talking about the war from Lexington, Kentucky, when you're experiencing the war. But I want to talk about how the war is affecting the ways in which technology is going to be integrated into Ukrainian life, the ways in which it's going to provide a technological foundation for the future of Ukraine's economy. We don't know a ton about the impact of a modern war on human capital, on technological acceptance, technological integration. The population of Ukraine was already really well educated even before this war. Now they're a lot better educated, especially about sort of the most modern technologies that enable modern war. But the things that enable modern war are the same technologies that enable modern life. And so the greater integration of communications and unmanned and so all sorts of other high bandwidth technologies, right? This is a level of expertise that the Ukrainian people have, which have been forced to adopt, which not a lot of Western populations actually necessarily have. And it's a really interesting question sort of moving forward, how much of that is going to stay, how much of that is going to stick, and how is that going to produce a foundation for the technological economy moving forward? And the second part of this, the second part of the impact of the war, this conflict has transformed the way that the defense industrial base in Europe and in North America function, right? It's really forced us to rethink what exactly we need in the West, what you need, obviously, but also what we need. But really, the future, and I call it's the transatlantic defense industrial base, because the F-35, for example, is built not just in North America, but all over Europe, right? There's every likelihood that Ukraine's going to be part of that moving forward, right? Ukraine used to be part of the post-Soviet defense industrial base, and that stopped being the case in 2014. But in the future, Ukraine's going to be part of the transatlantic defense industrial base. And that is a really high technology field, right? It's really lucrative. It's incredibly capital intensive. But the structures, the foundations, the physical plant, the human capital, the infrastructure, they're all there for Ukraine to be part of really the reformation of the defense industrial base across the entire transit. And I would go a step farther. It's not just the transatlantic, right? Because it extends to Japan and Korea and Australia. But Ukraine is going to be part of that, right? And Ukraine has a voice for what this new transatlantic defense industrial base is going to look like. And the shape of that is really going to affect what Ukrainian economic life and technological life is going to look like, not just 5 years down the road, but 15 or 20 years down the road, right? And so I think it's really important to be thoughtful about what we want that to look like, and to be thoughtful about Ukraine's role in sort of what this new industrial system is going to look like. That's pretty much all I have to offer today. As the discussion moves on, I'm happy to contribute, to answer any questions. But once again, I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Dear Professor Parley, the honor is all ours. The privilege is ours. Thank you very much for making it possible. I hope we will see you in person the day the victory comes, and you will visit our city and our university, Vasil Karazin Kharkiv National University. We will be honored to have all our speakers and all our guest members today. Dear friends, with your kind permission, maybe we will proceed to our further presenters, and then we will have a discussion to follow, just to accommodate everyone with time. So I would like to, I see that dear Professor Pooley is already with us. Dear Matt, are you with us?
Indeed, I am. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see you. I would like to introduce a great friend of Ukraine, a great friend of Vasil Karazin Kharkiv National University. I'm very happy to say a great friend of mine, dear Matt, Professor Pooley from Michigan State University, a leading expert on Ukraine, on Eastern Europe, a professor of history, a person who worked in the American embassy in Kiev and has an absolutely firsthand experience of everything we're going to be dealing with today. Dear Matt, we are incredibly happy to have you. Thank you so much for making it possible. Professor Pooley was with us from the start, from the second lecture of this project, and gave it his full support and inspiration. And I cannot express how grateful I am. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us.
Thank you. Добрий день. Добрий день. Slava Ukraini. It is very good to be back. It's very good to be back with you. I'm so sorry that I was late coming to the round table. So it's wonderful to hear the words of my colleagues and to see so many distinguished guests here as well. So I wanted to, my view is we all have a little bit to contribute to this discussion. I don't want to do anything in the way of an academic lecture, which I give too many. But I wanted to offer a few words on what I think are the central moments of our discussion here, right? The honoring of the victims of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, and then a few words about Ukraine's relationship with Europe, right? Since we're celebrating Europe Days. As I made Alia aware, when I worked for the U.S. Embassy so long ago now, I went to Crimea to honor the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, so honor the memory of that horror as an official delegation of the U.S. Embassy. So we went to Simferopol and we went to Bakhchisarai. And I was really blown away by my experience. I'd never been to Crimea before. And so this was my first encounter with Crimea. And it was amazing, the people that we met in Simferopol. So we met with representatives of the Medjlis and talked about political matters, social matters in Crimea, but we're also given a tour of a Crimean Tatar library, and that was especially enriching for me as a historian because I got to see Crimean Tatar literature from the 1920s during this period of Soviet rule in which Crimean Tatar language was supported by the Soviets, and there was a flourishing of Crimean Tatar national expression. But I only got a little bit of that opportunity to act as a historian. Mostly our concerns were obviously about the memory of the deportation, but also the very real present needs of the Crimean Tatar population at the time. So we met in Simferopol, and then, you know, as things were in those days, I was there with a fellow officer. It was just the two of us, and we just kind of made our way around Simferopol, hailing down cars for rides around the city. There was no official motor pool of the U.S. Embassy that provided us anything in the way of transportation. And then we relied on Medjlis representatives to get us to Bakhchisarai, to meet with additional representatives of Medjlis in Bakhchisarai, and most importantly, and of the greatest honor for me at the time, was to meet with Mustafa Jamilov, then head of the Medjlis. Met with him in his home, and was amazingly robust conversation with him. If you've ever met him, you know, he's a quite diminutive man, a man of short stature, but incredible power, right? Incredible passion, and an incredible certainty that he's on the right side of history. And he engages in these wonderful, he engaged at the time, and for anyone who was lucky enough to be able to meet him, would still, I have no doubt, engage in quite energetic conversations about the plight of the Crimean Tatars. At the time, I don't know if he's still a frequent smoker, but he was when I met him, and everything is done in between drags on a cigarette. So I want to, that was an amazing encounter for me. He had adopted adopted two children from Chechnya, and they were resident in the home, and I was introduced to them as well. They were expression of both Jamilov's disgust of Russian imperialism, and obviously of his solidarity with other Muslim peoples of the former Soviet Union. So that was revelatory to me as well. And then we made our way back to Simferopol in the middle of the night. I do want to read a few things from notes, if you forgive me, but I think it's important to get some of this history across. I understand those of you in Kharkiv understand it probably better than most, but I think it's important for the record of our discussion today, and I do have some insight briefly to offer as a historian. So the first thing I want to say is that we should remember that Crimea was first declared autonomous not by the Russians, but by the Crimean Tatar national movement. They did so in December of 1918, declaring the Crimean People's Republic. And then Crimea became a base for Russian nationalist activity led by the White Army, by Wrangel and Denikin's forces. So the question of what was autonomy was really a question that was first broached not by Russians at all, but by Crimean Tatars. And Soviet victory, although it made things complicated, certainly, for the positionality of Crimean Tatars, after some point in time, really by 1921, after Soviet conquest of Crimea, there was support for, as I already alluded to, for a certain amount of what we roughly translate as indigenization, right? An indigenization of Crimean Tatar national culture and Crimean Tatar political representation within the confines, of course, of what was the Soviet Union at the time. So I think we should remember that. And I could go further into history, obviously the history of the 20s and 30s and then the Second World War, but I'm not going to go into the detail of the deportation, but I do think because the nature of what Crimea is so debated now in the public space, that we should acknowledge that Crimean autonomy really ended with the deportation of the Crimean Tatars and the resettlement of Slavic migrants on Tatar land, right? And then it is the post-Soviet period in which the nature of Crimean autonomy is asserted, and Crimean Tatars have to find a place in that conversation, and it's a difficult conversation for them to have because they are not initially Ukrainian citizens, right? So they have to ensure that they have a place at the table, but that's a difficult thing to do when citizenship is not automatically granted to them. They had been deported to largely Central Asia and had made their way back to Crimea and were effectively stateless people. So that was the principal challenge of the Crimean Tatar movement, and the principal challenge to the way in which discussions about autonomy were attenuated by the Crimean Tatars. So I'd like to just put that out there, and then just say something about my discussions. So as I said, I went to Simferopol and Bakhchisarai to observe the commemoration of the deportation, and the overwhelming concern was political, right? So Crimean Tatars at the time constituted 12% of Crimea's population. And after the March 1998 election, the Crimean Tatars did not have a single representative in Crimea's parliament at the time. The only Crimean Tatar in the 96-member parliament was elected by the Communist Party ticket and was not considered by the Crimean Tatars, or at least most of them, as their representative. From 1994 to 1998, the Crimean Tatars had a quota of 14 seats in Crimea's 98-member legislature, but this was only a temporary provision for one electoral period only, and this whole arrangement was abolished before the March 1998 parliamentary elections to the Crimean parliament, which were to take place under the majoritarian system of one person, one vote, which effectively precluded Crimean Tatars who were scattered throughout Crimea, and again had only begun to acquire Ukrainian citizenship. By that point in time, a fair amount had, but they didn't have the political traction, obviously, that the Slavic populations in Crimea had. So what Jamilov spoke to me about, Chubarov, Refat Chubarov in Kyiv spoke to me about often, was this issue of political underrepresentation in Crimea, and remained a concern, but Kyiv largely was working, in my view, to satisfy these very real political concerns on the part of the Crimean Tatar population. So I'd like to jump maybe to more recent history. Certainly Crimean Tatars had representation in Verkhovna Rada, the national government, the national parliament in Ukraine, and they formed an electoral coalition with parties on the center right in Ukraine, most notably Narodny Ruch. And this is how the Ukrainian Tatar population was oriented at the time that the Russians invaded Crimea and annexed its territory. So on May 3rd, for those of you who don't understand this history or weren't following it at the time, on May 3rd, 2014, Jamilov tried to cross the border between Kherson Oblast and Crimea, and he was unable to do so. The Russian authorities then issued an arrest warrant for Dzhemilov and placed him on a federal wanted list, allegedly for trying to illegally cross the border when he attempted to return to Crimea. The Mejlis, the Crimean Tatar people, was then labeled an extremist organization and subsequently banned by Crimea's Supreme Court on April 26, 2016. Right, all horrific acts. So we should acknowledge this history. And I think lurking behind the situation of the Crimean Tatars today is this charge that the Soviets made against the Crimean Tatar population as a whole when they issued this ignominious decision to deport every Crimean Tatar down to the last woman and child, right? They alleged the entire Crimean nation was a collaborative nation, that all effectively, they were invading this charge that all Crimean Tatars had collaborated with the occupying German army, which was a ludicrous charge. But this history hangs over even the way in which Crimean Tatars are treated by Russian occupiers today. Right? Sort of there's a suspicion that they're never quite loyal to weren't loyal to the Soviet Union, which is really understood to be loyal to Moscow and loyal to Russia, and that's transposed to the current Russian state. So an expression of this lack of loyalty is the way in which Crimean Tatar political leaders were in alliance with Ukrainian patriotic parties, I think is the best way of describing them, right? So there's a pejorative rendering of the Rukh Mejlis alliance in the Russian imagination. They're seen as a consequence as traitors against Russia, allied with so-called, big air quotes, Ukrainian nationalists, and with anti-Moscow forces, as they had been during the war, is the implication. So to me, this is a one way of understanding the Russian approach still towards the Crimean Tatars. I'd like to read you just a brief quote, and then I'll move on to just a few remarks about Ukraine's relationship with Europe. I'm already spoken more. That I had much more I'd like to say, but I think traipsing around.
We're happy to have you. We never have enough.
Appreciate it. There's a lot. When you get a historian a few minutes, they're likely to go talk a great deal about the past, but the more recent past is what I'd like to address, and the present. So this is a quote from Vladimir Konstantinov, the Speaker of Crimea's parliament, that he made not so long after the annexation, the Russian annexation of Crimea, in which he said the following: "The West, through Ukraine, tried to tear off Crimea from Russia through the Crimean Tatars. They were used as a fifth column," right? So this is the persistent view on the part of the Russian government towards the Crimean Tatar population en masse. I'd say certainly officially they take pains at weighing charges of terrorism against the Crimean Tatar population, making examples of a few, and there are some Crimean Tatar politicians, very small number, who've worked with the Russian occupying authority, and those are held up as counter examples to what is really a campaign of slander against the Crimean Tatar population. So that's what I'd like to say about that. Frankly, I could say a lot more formally, but I just want to pause and argue that political concern, the way is really what the Crimean Tatar population was asking us as representatives of the U.S. government to consider is what really does Crimean autonomy mean? What does indigeneity mean? And how should that be reflected in the political, the way in which politics should have been done in Crimea? And my view is Ukraine was constantly moving in the direction, the national government in Kyiv was constantly moving in the direction to more satisfactorily address those concerns. And then there's a host of social and economic concerns, the chief concern of which was most certainly land, right? And the return of land that was taken from the Crimean Tatars when they were deported abhorrently from the Crimean Tatar, from what they view as the Crimean Tatar homeland. All right, lastly, European days. I could talk a great deal about this. I'd like to just say a few things motivated from my own research. That is, I work on the Soviet period, right? And I worked largely on on Central and Eastern Ukraine, really. I mean, I wrote a book about the entirety of Soviet Ukraine, but it didn't include Halichina and Western Volhynia and Bessarabia, right? Because they weren't part of the Soviet Union prior to 1939. So my comments are largely about the way in which I think even the Soviet Ukrainian period demonstrated the way in which Ukrainians were tied to Europe. And I'll just say a few quick things. So I wrote a book on education, Ukrainizatsiya, the promotion of Ukrainian national culture, particularly through the schools. And what was really interesting to me at the start of that project, which was now a very long time ago, is the way in which the Soviet Ukrainians had their own educational system, right, which was distinct from the educational system in the Russian Republic. This fact is lost, frankly, on so many of my colleagues who don't pay attention to Ukraine. In fact, I remember presenting at a conference and somebody sort of presumed that everything was run by Moscow. It wasn't. It was run out of Kharkiv as it regarded education. Obviously, the political parameters were set by the Communist Party in Moscow, no doubt. But the educational system was run by Republican authorities in Kharkiv, and it was distinct. It was much more pre-professional, is the shorthand way of describing it in English. All right, so Ukrainians had their own commissariat of education, known as Narkomos, by the Ukrainian language acronym, and this commissariat had representation in Europe. Emissaries from Narkomos, emissaries from Kharkiv, went out to France and Germany and Austria and elsewhere and acquired what they thought was first-rate pedagogical material, right? And theories to bring back to Kharkiv and then debate whether these things were applicable to Soviet Ukraine. And in fact, Soviet Ukrainians, at least for a time in the 20s, were so well engaged with Europe that Narkomos had a permanent representation in Berlin, in the Weimar Republic of Germany from 1922 to 1927, right? So absolutely, this is a linkage I see. And then I suppose we have another bookend to what my research was about, that is the repression of Ukrainizatsiya, the repression of Ukrainian national culture. And we can talk, I could talk about this a great deal, but I'd just like to point out what I'm sure many of you in Kharkiv know very well, that there's this Ukrainian writer, Mykola Filovi, right? Filovi, I don't know why, but I haven't had my second cup of coffee this morning, who wrote quite strongly that Ukraine could be communist, it could be socialist, but it didn't need to follow in a blind fashion the Russian example. So he famously said that Ukraine should move away from Moscow, not as a sort of rejection of all things Moscow, but that of all things that were coming out of Moscow, but as a rejection of the idea that Moscow alone should set the tenor of what being Soviet meant, right? What being a socialist Ukrainian meant. So I think that's interesting as well, right? Because where is he looking? He's looking towards Europe, and the left in Europe for inspiration as well. I could talk more. I'm engaged in this project on Odessa, and Odessa was a major medical center, but also a center for children's science, and European visitors came all the time to Odessa to witness what was going on in Soviet Odessa at the time, right? So there's absolutely a linkage with Europe in that regard. All right, lastly, last comment, I promise, is about teaching. So I made it through a rough semester here at Michigan State University. Some of you know we had a shooting on campus, killed 3 of our students, quite horrific. And our semester was hugely disrupted. As a result, it made it a challenge to teach. But I taught, as I have done for many years now, Soviet history and the history of the Second World War. And I'll just say that my never-ending goal is to remind students that Ukraine is a part of European history, to have them understand that. And I do that even in the history of the Second World War. So we're not so far removed from Victory Day, right? I seek as much as possible to remind my students that Ukrainians, according to the government figures are disputed, but so this may be the high water mark, but I take it as the mark that the Ukrainian government embraces. 7 million Ukrainians fought for Soviet victory over the fascists, right? And my students don't understand that at all, right? They really want to think, if they know anything, they think that Ukrainians automatically collaborated with the occupying Axis forces. And so my ambition is to remind them that Ukrainians are part of a common, it's a complicated story, obviously, but are part of a common European victory over fascism. And Soviet Ukrainians undoubtedly contributed to that. So the 7 million figure is drawn from both those who were recruited and volunteered from Soviet Ukraine, but also ethnic Ukrainians outside the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic who volunteered for service in the Red Army. But Ukrainians sacrificed, as you well know, better than I, inordinately to victory over Nazism, over fascism, and that's a common European victory that should be celebrated, and Ukrainian role in it, I think, needs to be underscored. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Alia.
Thank you, dear Matt. Thank you for your invaluable contribution to this discussion, for such a huge, profound insight into the history issues and the relation and the links between what used to be and what is now, and what brought Ukraine to its present total need to integrate into Europe and to and in these days of commemorating of this genocide that took place on the Tatar territory. And thank you very much for raising awareness. Such a professional academic view. It's simply, I cannot express how grateful we are. Thank you so much for being with us, for supporting us. And with your kind permission, I would like to give the floor to our final speaker for today, dear Professor Nicoleta Sintpos. Dear Professor Sintpos, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much. We are so honored. Professor Nicoleta Sintpos, Professor of Shakespeare Studies from the University of Worcester. I cannot express how grateful we are, and I would like to express huge thanks to our great friend, who is present with us today, Professor Michael Dobson, who was our dear guest this spring, the director of Shakespeare Institute in Stratford. Thank you so much for bringing us in touch with Professor Simpose. We are indebted, and we are very happy to give you the floor to speak about these days European international collaboration for Ukraine within the scope of your research and all possible issues. Thank you so much. We are very privileged.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Alina. I'm joining you not from Ukraine. I'm not joining you from the University of Worcester. I'm joining you from a point in the middle, from Warsaw, which is where I'm based at the moment, as it happens. But I've just returned from a week in Ukraine just a couple of days ago. It is a real privilege to join you today, and by no means do I deserve to be in such honorable company. The small contribution I'd like to bring today is picking up on the ideas that have been discussed so far, and I really appreciate Philippe's contribution earlier that comes from the side of theatre, because this is the side from which I would like to share a few thoughts. So if you bear with me, I only made it to your series of lectures, to my shame, very late in the game, but I'm deeply honoured and humbled to be part of it. My research in the last 10 years, my active research and publications have focused on what does it mean to participate in a European Shakespeare Festival. And I've been working closely with a number of festivals, in particular the Romanian festival in the southwest of Romania in Craiova, and with the Gdansk International Shakespeare Festival, both of which are co-founders of the European Shakespeare Festival Network, a European network of over 12 festivals at the moment. And I'd like to share a few thoughts about what these festivals have been doing, and the kind of relationship with Ukraine that they've been building throughout, but most importantly in the recent 18 months. And I hope that will give you literally a different picture. I brought some pictures with me, so if I am allowed, I will share a PowerPoint just to talk about how much Ukraine is in Europe from this point of view, and why Shakespeare is the language through which this is possible to achieve. So I'd like to share my screen if that's okay.
Can we please make Professor Simpose a co-host? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know whether the PowerPoint is visible to you. I'd like to say a few words about Shakespeare festivals as kind of three types of festivals that have taken place for the last 30 years in the Europe, and primarily in relation to what we call these days the membership of the European Union. And I'd like to start from the suggestion that festivals are usually defined in the world of theatre, but also beyond, in terms of three categories they might be specific to. They can be destination festivals, where very clearly the attraction of going to such a festival is the location. So it's either a city where people gather, or a particular fringe sort of geographical location that makes the destination of a festival. Site-specific festivals are festivals that are related to a particular building or a particular historical site, heritage site, and so on. And community festivals are usually festivals generated by grassroots sort of type of cultural event, if you want, in the sense Shakespeare festivals do it, generated by a community in the services of that community, and subsidized, supported, and sustained by that community. And I'm kind of bringing to your attention these three different definitions that sociologists and anthropologists have been used in relation to festivals and festivities in different cultures, in order to say a few things about what European festivals have been doing, and where we are now. And I'd like my last few examples to come from Ukraine and my recent in-person experience there. Shakespeare festivals in the English-speaking world have become tourist shrines in their own right. Many critics argue, especially when they talk about Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK or the London Globe in London, but we also talk about the Stratford, Ontario Festival in that sense. And though these festivals have been the focus of critical attention in regular reviewing by specialist journals, Shakespeare festivals on continental Europe are comparatively a very recent addition to the global tourist circuit and a relatively new topic of research in Shakespeare studies. And together with two other colleagues, Professor Paul Prescott and Professor Florent March, we have just released a book on Shakespeare on European festival stages, which came out with Bloomsbury in the spring of last year. So I've been preoccupied in particular with what happens on the circuit of European festivals that is very, very different in terms of practical issues, in terms of the framework, of the structure and the cultural and social and political agency that they have when we talk about Europe. They're very, very distinct from North American Shakespeare festivals and have a completely different tradition and history. I'm not going to bore you with all the examples of the European Shakespeare festivals in the network. As I said, there are about 12 of them, but I'm just going to go very quickly through a number of slides that show you the year when particular festivals have been founded in the different parts of Europe, just to be able to bring these suggestions together and see what example Ukraine gives us now that defies every type of theorizing that we've seen before, and perhaps where we go from here. So my interest here is to think about destination festivals, site-specific festivals, community festivals in the years when they have been founded. So the first in the network was founded in Neuss in Germany in a space that is very clearly replicating the Globe Theatre, and it goes down in history as the third Globe. Yeah, I'm not going to enter the debates about who has the first and who has the second. But this festival was founded in 1991, has a very interesting history. It bought the Globe Theatre from a gardening festival that didn't want anything to do with it in the late 80s and set it up as a exclusively Shakespeare festival. So you can see why this is clearly site-specific and has become a destination. The second one, chronologically, is the International Shakespeare Festival in Craiova in the southwest of Romania, which was founded in 1994. And this has no site-specific sort of reason to go there. It's a theatre that looks very much like the theatre built in Ivano-Frankivsk, if you want, as a comparison. But it has a huge cultural and community appeal now in a very industrial city of Romania with about 150,000 inhabitants and end of the 19th century university. So this sort of defies the kind of definitions that festivals take. The next one, chronologically, in 1997 is the International Shakespeare Festival in Gdansk, Poland, which happened again in the local theatre, in the streets, and at the same time with the Dominican Festival since 1997. But in 2014, it gained its own very Shakespeare footprint, which you can see the picture on the left-hand side of Theatre Shakespearovsky, a project that constructs a very versatile in terms of shape and transformation theatre on the footprint of the 16th century fencing school, which hosted theatre productions touring to the Baltic Sea at the time. So you can see how this has become clearly a destination, but also a Shakespeare site-specific festival. The rest of the festivals in the network are all, third millennium festivals. The one in Catalonia, which started in 2003, the one in Armenia, which started in 2004. They're very, very specific to the artistic kind of purposes. The Hungarian Shakespeare Festival in the town of Gyula in 2005, which is taking place around and in the town of the Gyula Castle, the only surviving medieval fortress in Central and Eastern Europe. So site specificity is quite important there. The summer festival in Ostrava, one of the 4 kind of castles that host Shakespeare festivaling, if you want, was launched in 2008. A very clearly site-specific one is the Shakespeare Festival in Elsinore, in Hamlet's Castle, where productions of this particular play date back to 1816, and the sense of a festival on this location is claimed by the festival. But this is a 2008 kind of rebirth of it, if you want. I'm gonna mention the Shakespeare Globe London 2012 Globe to Globe Festival, which hosted the complete works of Shakespeare in kind of close proximity and part of the framework of the Olympiad, part of the Cultural Olympiad, and which incentivized and gave birth to 2 other Shakespeare festivals in 2 completely different parts of Europe, courtesy of the fact that productions from those corners of Europe joined the complete works in 2012 with commissioned plays. One of them is the Bitola National Festival in Macedonia. And again, they're using 2 venues, one very, very modern and one that clearly goes back to classical theatre. And the Ithaca Shakespeare Festival in Serbia, which opens up a villa by the sea to the public and to the community first, and then to the wider public. It's a villa that is private property, and before that it was nationalized by the government and the party, of course, and it's never been opened to the public. So it is the Shakespeare Festival that kind of opens this heritage location to the public. You get to experience Shakespeare through that. A 2014 birth, again, a big year in Shakespeare kind of anniversaries, 450 years since Shakespeare's birth, and the festival Shake Nice, which is taking place has been taking place in the south of France. And finally, last but not least, is the York International Shakespeare Festival, the only UK-based international festival that is part of the network, which was open in 2015. And you can see on the right-hand side pictures from this year's edition with a poster of their first production, The Rape of Lucrece, and the launch of the festival book that I've mentioned. And at the bottom right, with the workshop that the Molodi Theatre did for the community of spectators, for the community of festival goers, but also for the community of refugees, not just Ukrainian refugees, but refugees in York. As you might know, York is a sanctuary city in the UK. So in that sense, it holds special status in terms of receiving refugees from all over the world. I'd like to move very, very quickly to the kind of stuff that the European Shakespeare Festival Network has been doing in terms of its constitution and supporting festivals who are members. So it's looking very clearly at promoting Shakespeare's works, at educational projects, at artistic initiatives across countries, across communities of practitioners, supporting not just theatrical work, but also translation and scholarly work and related activities. And in its over 10 years of existence, it was founded in 2010 by 6 of the founding festivals that I've spoken about, and it's done a number of things in terms of facilitating what I call Shakespeare Festival as a cultural product, but also as a community building and as a tourist sort of work that helps communities to build economic as well as cultural resilience. I'm not going to bore you with some of the potential paradigms of discussing that, but I'd like to move very, very swiftly to for you to get a sense of what is happening in this community of festivals and where Ukraine fits in here, as I believe it does. Of course, like everything else, the COVID pandemic has halted a lot of the festivaling in person in the year 2020 and 2021. But it also faced festivals with different challenges and with different options. Some festivals decided to go immediately online and have a range of activities in the digital sort of festivaling space. Others refused to do that completely and either took a year off or when they came back in 2021 had very, very small provisions. So the 2 years of cultural, I suppose, blackout, if you want, and several changes and I suppose financial recession and governmental policies that have started to move into the kind of political right, if you want, have affected what happens in the network of festivals and the kind of things that festivals can still do. The year 2022 spoke clearly to some of these challenges, but also about them, as well as about challenges that Shakespeare faced in Europe. In Gyula, for example, the Hungarian government pushed its right-wing agenda and insisted on de-internationalizing the festival. And in that sense, it sort of destroyed it. Across the board there, on the other hand, in Romania, the Craiova International Shakespeare Festival reached a completely different stage of development, having started very modestly in 1994 as a city festival held in a medium-sized industrial university city with 6 productions, 5 from its own kind of pool of Shakespeare productions, Romanian ones, and 1 international production. In 2022, it became a festival city. One that was embraced fully by its community, one that built bridges across all its neighborhoods, one that embraced all its potential and challenges in over 106 performances in over 60 different venues across the city. In 2023, Gyula unfortunately announced that it closes down. Craiova, on the other hand, announced that it will move from being a every 2-year festival, that it will move to being an every-year festival. So different political changes in Europe and in countries' relationships with the European Union have affected what's happening to festivals. And in my little slideshow of festivals in Europe, you probably got a sense that quite a lot of the festivals have in Central and Eastern Europe have been founded immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there's a very, very clear link there. And it's also a link to an older tradition of European festivals and Shakespeare in particular and theatre, which takes us back to the Second World War. I'll say a few things about that, if I may. Back in 1994, the editors of the volume Shakespeare and the New Europe, which remembered the conference they attended in 1992, and which generated the first collaborative effort on the topic of Shakespeare and what they called the New Europe, as an event in which, and I quote from the editors, Mick Hathaway and Boyka Sokolova, they spent time unpacking the ways in which Shakespearean texts have always served as a register and touchstone for social and political change. And they warned that dogmatic Marxism could be replaced by dogmatic liberalism, and concluded that Shakespeare never offered reflections of contemporary realities, but always reflections upon them. While a fit celebration for the 10th anniversary, the project Shake the Walls, which took place in 2020 at the Gdansk Shakespeare Festival, served as a reminder of how true these words still ring 25 years on. And it is precisely a venture such as Shake the Walls that invites everyone to take heart from the topicality, the resilience, and the versatility of Shakespeare collaborations, and renews the hope in the work Shakespeare festivals can do. And I'd like to move to Ukraine now. The first picture in my slides about Ukraine is a picture of Hamlet in a production of Hamlet wearing the Ukrainian flag. The Salzburg Festival, which I didn't speak about it and it'll become apparent why, can only be understood in the context of the First World War, with its co-founder Max Reinhardt viewing the festival as a peace mission and as a place of pilgrimage for the innumerable people who long to be redeemed through art following the bloody atrocities, unquote. Like the Avignon Festival in France, the Edinburgh International Festival owes its origins to the urgent imperative to rebuild a sense of community in a continent that has been torn apart by the tragedies of the Second World War, to restore faith, to heal the heartache of shattered lives through music, opera, drama, dance, literature, painting, to pick up the fragments of a civilization shaken to its core by the atrocities of Leningrad and Auschwitz. In the words of John Falconer, Lord Provost at the time, the Edinburgh Festival was to be one whose ambition was to embrace the world. As with Western Europe after the Second World War, so with the former Soviet bloc of Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of the empire in the late 80s and 1990s. And it is striking that almost half of the festival featured in my presentation are based in former Soviet bloc countries. And that might give some indication of where we build from here. How do we reinforce the bridges between Ukraine and Europe? The optimistic vision of healing and peacemaking capacity of culture is hardwired into the ethos of festivity and continues to underwrite the philosophy of Shakespeare festival makers across Europe. In advertising their 2019 season, the artistic directors of the Bitola Shakespeare Festival in Macedonia invited their audiences to imagine the world and humanity came to an end. All our civilization, all we know it today. It's supposed, we suggest, that it could be rebuilt and reconstructed solely based on the works of William Shakespeare, unquote. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the undead Dane of Rodislav Derzhepilsky's Hamlet at Ivan Franko Music and Drama Theatre in Ivano-Frankivsk started to drape a Ukrainian flag around his shoulders. And as Michael Dobson wrote about, this particular act affirmed a new struggle for survival, thus connecting a traumatic past with a traumatic present. Professor Maya Harbuziuk from the University of Lviv has written how this production, to use Jan Kot's simile, has, like a sponge, soaked up history by moving into a bomb shelter. At the same time, a new Hamlet horror opera by Roman Hrikhorev, Ilya Razumienko, and Rodislav Derzhepilsky is also being performed there. Hamlet, as you see in this picture, has now become a Ukrainian play about rights of memory and horror. Writing about how festivals nurture resilience in regional communities, Rose Deret talks about festivals as events that build social capital and in community development terms showcase the strength of a community at play and demonstrate this community's capacity to cope with external stresses and disturbance as a result of social, political, and environmental change. I'm going to leave this to float there for a little bit as a quotation before I talk about Ukraine and Shakespeare festivals this year and the kind of role they played. As the world cannot easily travel to Ukraine at the moment, the European Shakespeare Festival Network has tried to mitigate this process by bringing Ukraine to the world and to festivals. Coriolanus from the National Theatre in Kyiv traveled to the Craiova International Shakespeare Festival and opened this incognito edition of the festival. This year, Craiova wasn't going to have a festival. It's their kind of gap year. But they decided to have a mini celebration, a 3-day long festival dedicated to Shakespeare called Poduri de Teatru, Theatre Bridges. And the key production that was invited to this was the Kyiv National Theatre Coriolanus production. It was a very difficult production to perform for the Ukrainian company. It was a gruesome production about war, about casualties, about political choices, and so on. As you can see in the two pictures, it was also an extremely demanding production in terms of set and in terms of cast to bring at any festival in any conditions. And as you can see, most of the actors on the stage are men. So the diplomatic work that had to take place for a festival to bring across out of Ukraine male actors was quite something. So for until the day before, when they arrived and started to mount the set in the Craiova National Theatre, we weren't sure whether Ukraine will physically be present at this festival. I'm going to fast forward a week later, and I'm going to take you to York in the north of England, at the York International Shakespeare Festival, where a different play and a different company managed to overcome all the, as I said, diplomatic bureaucracy and so on, and defy the odds, traveling to perform A Midsummer Night's Dream, another difficult play because it starts with a war in which one nation loses and one wins. As you can see in the pictures, it's a much smaller production, but nevertheless, it was one that was celebrated most at the festival among the international visiting production. It's also, like in Craiova, the arrival of the Ukrainian productions have also enabled the Ukrainian community currently in the respective cities to join. In both cases, different projects have been launched. In York, the Shakespeare Sanctuary was launched that brought together projects that worked with the community of refugees in particular, and so on. We appealed to the tradition of going to festivals among friends and citizens, that if they can't join the festival, they can buy a ticket and pass it on. So communities who don't normally have access to this have been able to do that, and we hope that this will be one of the practices that all festivals will employ from now on. But nothing like 25 years of going to festivals and reading about them and writing about them prepared for what I was to experience in Ukraine last week. And I'm going to share with you a few pictures, and I hope you don't find them particularly triggering. The first pictures are that I'm offering you are in relation to a production of Romeo and Juliet. This is not a new production. What is particularly new about this production, which is taking place in Ivan Franko Theatre in Ivano-Frankivsk, is the fact that it started as a production which was divided in two parts. The first part was happening in a dilapidated, in a derelict factory. So you can imagine that the huge space kind of was the equivalent of the city of Verona, in its kind of traditions kind of broken down. And the funeral procession moved from this factory into the theatre and into the basement of the theatre, which became the tomb of the Capulets and where the lovers end up being buried. When I saw this production on the 12th of May, the entirety of Romeo and Juliet, from the beginning to the end, happened in the basement of one of the basements of the Ivan Franko Theatre, which doubles as a shelter for the population. So anybody who lives in the proximity and anybody who, like me, was in the hotel next to the theatre, when the sirens rang that night, we all had to go into what I instinctively thought of not as a shelter, but as a theatre. The production opens with this cage that you can see on the right-hand side, Romeo inside, Juliet outside. The production opens with Romeo dead in Juliet's lap. And with all my kind of understanding of Romeo and Juliet that I've seen before, the first image that I had in mind when I saw this caged couple, a female figure holding the dead young man, I thought immediately of Michelangelo's Pietà, like most of the spectators. what I wasn't prepared to do at the beginning of the production, but what I learned by the end of this production, which took place, as I said, in its entirety in the shelter, in the bomb shelter, might be explained by the picture on the left-hand side. That's a picture that I took a day earlier when I was in the old city center of Lviv. And you can see a monument, yeah? You can see the statue of Virgin Mary, which is surrounded by a bed of beautiful tulips at the moment, and which has a very clear banner next to it with the flag of Ukraine, which says, "Please pray for Ukraine." And the very fragile, pure white statue in the middle of it is protected by a layer of fence and then by heavy scaffolding, as you can see. And it was at the end of the play, Romeo and Juliet, in the basement of Ivan Franko Theatre, that I realized that the production, which returned to the point of Romeo lying dead in Juliet's arms, both dressed in white, was nothing to do with Michelangelo's Pieta, but more to do with how Ukraine is thinking of its young generation and of the future. This is the young generation that Ukraine is trying to protect. This is the generation that will build the future of it. And without a doubt, in this production, at the end of it, all the older generation is inside the cage, and the two young Romeo and Juliet, dressed in white, ascend to the staircase, improvised as it was, on the right-hand side of the stage, in the cone of light, and that is their future monument. After the production, the following day, we had the opportunity to talk to Rostislav Drzepiski and other people in the theatre, and we talked about Ukraine. We weren't talking about the war. We weren't talking about the raid that happened the night before. We were talking about how Ukraine can begin to plan a Shakespeare festival. Could Ukraine be eligible to be part of the European Shakespeare Festival network? How can that be done, and when? That was a very emotional and powerful and insightful discussion, which lasted for over 3 hours. And I'd like to share my final few thoughts on this, all fueled by the 4 days that I have spent in Ukraine, in the beautiful, brave country of Ukraine, in 3 of its cities. And I would like to share with you the last 2 pictures that I have. Of course, we couldn't leave without seeing another production. So I had the opportunity to see Lesha Ukrainska's Mavka, the Forest Song, which in this particular production was joined by another short story by the famous Ukrainian writer. But it took place, and this is the striking image that you see on the left-hand side, in another shelter in the theatre Ivan Franko, one that the director is proud to say is now kitted with proper air circulation, so it can be used as a shelter and as a theatre at the same time, at any time. So this production of Mavka, the Forest Song, and the story of Judas the Iscariot take place in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what you see on the left-hand side is a reconstruction of this Garden of Gethsemane. I'm not going to talk about the symbolism of this at all. On the right-hand side, you can see the final few moments in this production, which happens in the round, with the public sitting at wooden tables, the kind of tables that Lukasz's uncle built in front of us throughout the production. So we are part of that community there. This is the final song that Mavka sings as she breaks the bread and shares it with the entire community in the theatre. It's a very long moment. It took over 5 minutes for the entire audience in the theatre to be passed on a piece of the bread that Mavka is sharing. As I saw that, and as I was talking to people in the theatre who made this wonderful production happen the following day, these are the last words that came to my mind. Festivals are about community, about shared spaces and celebration of shared values, cultural, artistic, social, and historical. I have been involved with festivals for 25 years, and I have been researching and publishing on festivals for 10 of these years. But being in Ukraine for 5 days last week taught me a lot more than all of these years. Festivals are not only about being with the community or even being for the community. And when you have a theater that doubles as a shelter and as a church that shares communion with its audience, this is already a festival. It is a new definition of what a Shakespeare festival is. It is being the community. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Simpos. And on behalf of, thank you so much for your amazing talk. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being so sincere and so much on the nerve with us. Thank you so much. We are enormously grateful, eternally grateful on the part of Vasil Karazin, Kharkiv National University, our rectorate, our dear Dean, Svetlana Andreevna Virochenko, with whose kind initiative and inspiration this event could never have taken place. Our dear head of international relations, Pani Olinik, without whose kind help I would never be able to bring this to life. I would like to thank our dear guests, our dear audience, for such a diverse approach, but such an important step, I believe, in creating a memory link, a connection, a multimodal approach to preventing situations of genocide into the future, for making us remember what happened, for making this situation not become post-traumatic, for creating multi-layered cultural memories that will help us move on without forgetting the past and with preventing genocide incidents happening from the future. We are so grateful to everyone who in this or that way contributed to the events. Without our previous presenters, this event would not be possible. And we are forever grateful and hoping that this project, Speakers of the World in support of Vasil Karazin, Kharkiv National University, will go on. And I would like to express my special thanks to our dear Public Relations Department and its head, Maxim Anatolievich Folomiev, and its amazing staff that made this event possible under shelling, like they made all the events that took place starting with the month of February. The real heroes, people who provided all technical support and all organizational support to me in this project. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you and to our dear university team. I am proud to be part of this university, and I am proud to be further looking for our next speakers and to represent it in the world. And now, with your kind permission, I would like to give the word for our final greetings to our Deputy Dean, Professor Anishenko, the person who's been representing the scientific research of our faculty for, I guess, 20 years, maybe more. Dear Natalia Anatolievna, thank you so much. It's an honor that you're with us today, and the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Dear friends, it's a great honor for our university, for the School of Foreign Languages in particular, to welcome such distinguished guests, outstanding persons in different fields. And I was amazed at the power that comes from the beliefs of today's speakers. What we have heard today is not just words. These are the results of deep research aimed at revealing the truth about the genocide of the world, to support Ukrainians in the struggle for peace and freedom. And I hope that that current project, One Lecture to the Victory, made possible thanks to Professor Legeda, will find its continuation in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dear Natalia Anatolievna. Thank you, dear friends. If you have some questions, you're very welcome now. If you have no questions, maybe we've been given too much food for thought. We would like to welcome you at our further events, and I'm very happy and very honored to announce that our next event is going to take place on Tuesday, and we are going to be honored by the lecture of Professor Mary Jo Salter, who is with us today. Dear Professor Salter, it's a great honor. The lecture will be dedicated to Emily Dickinson. We are very happy and very much looking forward to having you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so
honor
much.
to be your correspondent. I was honored with not only seeing you, but also with reading your texts. Thank you so much. And your letters. And that was simply amazing. Thank you so much. We are very much looking forward to having you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dear Karazin academic community, наші шановні мужні каразинці, дякую вам за вашу участь. Дякую нашому шановному керівництву, нашому улюбленому університету за стійкість, за боротьбу щодо нашої перемоги, за виборювання свободи для нашої країни. Дякую вам від всієї душі. Thank you, our dear guests. Єдине, що можу сказати, слава Каразинському, слава Харкову, слава Україні.
Героям слава. Дякую вам.
Дякую вам.
Героям слава.
So much.